Playmates is back with a new line of Star Trek action figures. But why would I spend $13 on this Commander Riker when I can get an original for $5? Well, I'll try to answer that question on this episode of Geek Dad Life. First hitting toy shelves in the fall of 1992, Playmates' Star Trek action figure line was second only to those Ninja Turtles as Playmates' biggest toy line of the 90s. Going until 1999, the original Playmates Star Trek run was the first successful Star Trek toy line because it catered to both the adult collector fans of the series as well as kids. But it is because all of those adult collectors bought so many of those Star Trek figures and kept them on card that the secondary market for those toys today is really, really cheap. You can easily find carded Star Trek figures from Playmates going for $2.50, $5, maybe $10 a figure at flea markets, toy shows, eBay, and vintage toy shops. So when Playmates announced that they were back in the Star Trek action figure game after a very poorly executed 2009 run to support the J.J. Abrams movie, I was excited but apprehensive. The new toys promised to go back to that classic 90s 4.5-inch Playmate scale, while giving us more modern articulation and sculpting. But in my opinion, those original 90s Star Trek Playmates toys really hold up today, and when you can find them for so cheap, is there enough of a difference from these new figures, which are reasonably priced at $13 a figure, give or take, when you can still get some really high quality figures for around $5? The only way I think we can do that is to compare these figures side by side. The packaging runs straight off of nostalgia, featuring card art designs inspired directly from the 90s TOS and TNG figure releases, albeit in a shorter form. I always loved the TNG cards that featured Enterprise D with its big saucer leading the top of the card, and it's a welcome sight here on these new figures. The classic Star Trek card art is a callback to the 90s releases, but I wish they would have done something different for the original cast movie series that had its own design style and look compared to the original series. Both cards celebrate different anniversaries, the 40th anniversary for Wrath of Khan for the TOS cards, and the 35th anniversary of the Next Generation on the TNG cards. I have not found any of the Discovery figures yet, but they also have their own card back design. The backs feature a simplified version of the original cross-sell, including the bio cards, which omit some of the information in favor of these Q codes that you can scan on your phone, and it'll take you to more information about the Playmates toy line. Taking the figures out of the package, the results are a bit of a mixed bag. These figures and releases are light years better than the 2009 Playmates releases, but when you have them side by side to the 90s line, they fare okay, but in my opinion, they don't exceed the quality of the 90s releases. Starting with the head sculpting on these figures, they're clearly using some type of a face scan technology, very similar to what Hasbro has used, and some of those head sculpts are done really well and some miss the mark. Patrick Stewart's Picard and Brent Spiner's Data look really nice, while Commander Riker just looks like a generic bearded dude instead of the very well-known Jonathan Frakes. The same is true for the Wrath of Khan figures, where both Spock and Khan really do look like the actors that portray them, but when you get to the Kirk, he's the worst of the bunch. It doesn't look like William Shatner at all. It is honestly, I don't even know what this face sculpt is supposed to be. I don't even know if it's human. That's how bad I think this one turned out. Compare that to the 90s sculpts that obviously have a more stylized look than the life scans of the new ones, but what those original 90s figures did more often than not was really capture the essence of the actors that played these characters. The rest of the sculpting on these figures is solid. The proportions are accurate to the lifelike characters that we see on screen. I will say that the copyright stamp on the back of the figure is way too large and really detracts from the look of the figure if you're looking at it from the back. But if you're looking at the front, I think it looks pretty good. Paint apps are solid as well. A little sloppiness here and there, but overall pretty good. Also, the eyes aren't perfect on a lot of the figures, but generally for a modern release at $13, I think they did a pretty good job. The accessories are straight out of the 90s toy line. You have a figure stand, you have phasers with, little red attachments to them. You got a whole bunch of accessories that we would have seen on a 90s figure with these ones as well. I really dig it, even though the hands don't do the best job of holding said accessories. But the same problem was true with the original toy line. The articulation is where we're supposed to see big improvements compared to the original figures, and that is true in some cases, primarily with the arms and the legs and the hands on these figures. You got a lot more articulation compared to the 90s figures. I will say omitting any type of waist or ab articulation is a bit of an odd choice here. I get that an ab crunch or cut would break up the sculpt, but not even including a waist cut really limits the posability for the figures. And the plastic that they use for the midsections feels really cheap and hollow, and generally brings down the overall feel and look of these action figures. Let's also talk about how they scale with the original 90s toys, coming in a bit taller than their vintage counterparts. For a toy line that is leaning so heavily on the nostalgia for the original 90s toys, one would think they would have tried to make the appearance of these new figures be able to sit side by side fairly well with the original releases, much like Mattel has done with the Motu Origins line. Now, I'm not asking for exacting one-for-one recreations of the 90s toys, but I would have liked to be able to add new characters from, say, the Fantastic New series Strange New Worlds alongside my vintage 90s Playmates counterparts. So for this first wave of Star Trek figures from Playmates, I think if it's a classic Star Trek character that has an original 90s release, you'll be able to spend less money and get what I think is a better figure than the new offering at $13 retail. And for figures of new characters that we have not gotten yet in the Playmates line, I hope they continue to strive to make them look like they could stand alongside their vintage counterparts. If you want to keep watching, check out this video. And until next time, hasta luego and goodbye.